Hello and welcome to Euronews. I'm Maria Tadeo, and this is a special report. We are coming to you live from Brussels, where European leaders are gathering for a summit torn between two wars and a looming energy crisis. The European Central Bank saying stagflation is now a real possibility for the European economy, high inflation and low growth. All of this amid escalation in the Middle East, strikes by both Iran and Israel, sending oil prices and gas prices today soaring 30% on the day. Of course, we are going to debrief these with our correspondents Shauna Murray and Maria Tadeo, as well as our guests. But before we do that, let's take a look at what European leaders have been telling us.
There are no alternative of international rules-based order, because the alternative is the war in Ukraine. The alternative is unfair competition on trade.
We will continue to ask for de-escalation. What we saw this morning happening over the last hours has a direct impact on the region, but also on Europe, not only in terms of security, but also in terms of rising prices that we see on energy sources that we are dependent on.
The Iran's attacks on Qatar energy infrastructure create further chaos, and it's clear that we need an exit from this war, not escalation.
This is a very defining moment for the European Union, and I think that we need to send a clear message to our citizens and the rest of the world that Europe is with multilateralism and is with international law, and we are against this war.
We would like to get the oil which is ours from the Ukrainians, which is now blocked by the Ukrainians. I will never support any kind of decision here which is in favor of Ukraine. Still, the Hungarians are not able to get the oil which belongs to us. So, it's not a joke. It's not a political game. Zelensky should understand it, that this is not a game.
We have to do the loan. It's as simple as that. It has been politically decided, so it has to be executed. We have to continue to support Ukraine financially, but I also believe that Europe should be present at the negotiating table.
European leaders calling for de-escalation, but of course that is easier said than done. I also want to bring you some new lines from the President of the United States, speaking to reporters, saying once again this war is needed, it is necessary, it was something that was required for global security. President Trump also telling reporters he will not put boots on the ground in Iran, and says that it will end soon without giving details. But of course that is the big question, and it is the question for European leaders to gathering in Brussels. Let's now go to Shauna Murray, who's been monitoring the summit since it started about 9 hours ago now. Shauna, this summit was supposed to be about the European economy, was supposed to be about bolstering the European industry, and now it's been completely rattled by the geopolitics.
That's right, Maria. Another EU summit, another situation where the EU is forced to respond to a crisis not of its making. At this stage, of course, the Iran war. And EU leaders have really responded in the past few days quite harshly at what's happening in Iran, because of the fact that they weren't given any information ahead. They weren't consulted. Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, said that if he had been consulted, he would have advised against this war. Meanwhile, however, they do realise that this is going to have a major impact on the European economy, and worse if they don't respond. And what we've heard in the past hour or so, because EU leaders have sort of completed their discussion around the Middle East, what they're saying is they're trying to come up with some ways to deal with the very dramatic situation, which is a quote from an EU source. Now, there is no necessary solution to that yet, because what they have clarified is they won't be sending their people into harm's way. So they won't be sending sailors or EU vessels into a hot conflict. And we've also seen a statement from the G7, including Japan and the Netherlands, saying that they would also try to talk to the United States to come up with a solution. But again, really very much making it clear that they won't be putting EU people into harm's way, nor will they be reducing assets from places like the Baltics or the Arctic. Maria?
So, Shauna, thank you so much for that. And I also want to bring, as I say, some new lines, because President Trump is also saying that he will not allow Israel to hit energy facilities. Obviously, there was a hit on an Iranian gas field that has sent gas prices soaring today, 30% up on the day. The president of the U.S. also repeating that he is disappointed, I should note, at NATO allies.
NATO's making a very foolish mistake. I'm disappointed in NATO. We spend trillions of dollars on NATO. You know, I wonder whether or not NATO would ever be there for us. And when they don't help us, I mean, it's certainly something that we should think about. We don't need too much help, and we don't need any help, actually. We, as the United States, have to remember that.
And once again, those are the comments from the president of the U.S. saying he's disappointed at NATO. And Shauna, going back to you on the question of energy, because that is a relevant question for the Europeans. What can they do, if anything? Oil is above $100 a barrel. Gas is up 30-day on the day. What can they do?
Well, this is a real problem because you have sort of factions really emerging with the European Union saying that, well, maybe we should totally dismantle some of our green policies because they're costing too much money. And you have other member states saying, no, we need to actually charge ahead with renewables, because if we were in this situation, if we had charged ahead with renewables and green policies a long time ago, we wouldn't be so reliant on fossil fuels. And therefore, the impact of this situation in the Strait of Hormuz wouldn't be damaging our economy at the moment. So that is actually one of the key discussions surrounding that. And it's probably one of the only areas where the EU has some control. The only problem is getting a consensus. Maria?
Of course, and that is not a minor problem. And now let's go to the U.S. because we are joined by John Bolton, the former national security advisor to President Trump. Sir, thank you so much for joining us on Euronews.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
And, of course, you worked very closely with the president in his first term. You know how he works. You know his psyche, his mind. And that is important because ultimately he is the commander-in-chief. What we're seeing now is a timeline that looks erratic. The goals appear to be changing. Is there a plan?
Well, I don't think anybody knows the answer to that, including Donald Trump. I think he said at the outset his goal was regime change. Many of his advisors have said the goal was something else. But as recently as a few days ago in a speech in Kentucky, Trump said, we don't want to have to come back and do this every 2 years, which strongly implies regime change in his mind is still the objective.
So that is the goal, and you're also a vocal supporter of regime change in Iran. But from the outside, it seems this regime is not changing, or if anything, is doubling down on the hardliners, and the protests are not really happening. Is regime change really possible now, 3 weeks into this war?
Well, it took them 47 years to build the regime, so I don't think anybody should be surprised that it hasn't collapsed in 3 weeks. Hundreds of top leaders have been eliminated. And the bases and communications and assets of the Revolutionary Guard have been decimated. It's not really a question of the people going out in the streets. It's a question of working with figures in the regime who don't want to go down with the ship and who, as the regime comes apart at the top, will come over to the side of the opposition.
So can I ask you very bluntly, is this now a moment where the U.S. and Israel need to double down until it's done?
Well, I think if Trump really wants regime change, he certainly could have done a lot better preparation for it. But if that's your objective, you have to have patience and persistence to see it through, because if you give up before you accomplish it, you may be worse off than if you had never started it.
Okay, so if you want to accomplish it, however, the president was clear today that he will not put boots on the ground. Is he going to have to in the end?
Well, that's what he says today. Who knows what he'll say tomorrow? I mean, there is a contingent of Marines on the way, and we'll see how things develop.
And if this doesn't go well for the president, are we looking at the biggest diplomatic disaster for the U.S. in decades? Do you look at this as a major mistake, strategic mistake?
Well, Trump will declare victory no matter what happens. And the argument will be that the nuclear weapons program has been set back further, that their support for international terrorism has been set back further. But if the regime survives, however much damage has been done to it, it will build back, and the nuclear threat and the terrorism threat will simply return.
And of course, that means that the Operation Epic Fury becomes an epic flop. I do want to ask you, however, in terms of the coordination with Israel, we did see the president saying Israel should not hit energy, and he also put out that social media post saying Israel is slashing, they need to stop that. How close do you think these two are working?
Well, I think they're working very closely. In the White House this morning with Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi there, he said he had spoken to Netanyahu, that he was aware of the attack, and that he suggested Netanyahu not do it. But then he said, we're very well coordinated and everything's fine.
And let me just ask you a final question, sir. When it comes to Europeans, today we saw once again, the idea that the Europeans are not rushing to help in the Strait of Hormuz. They also say that the region needs to de-escalate at this stage. And some voices even say this war is totally illegal. So is that going to be a problem for the Europeans and President Trump going forward when it comes, certainly in the context of NATO?
Well, I think it is a problem because the European reaction is incorrect. This is Europe's war. Europe's just as much, even more at risk on the nuclear
side. Why, sir? Why is it Europe's war?
Because Europe is just as much, if not more, at risk from nuclear attacks. If Iran gets nuclear weapons, it has the missile capability to hit Central and Eastern Europe, not the United States. And Iran has carried out terrorist attacks in Europe. And to say, as some European leaders have, that it's not Europe's war is simply an invitation to Donald Trump to say, okay, fine, it's not Europe's war. And, Ukraine, it's not America's war. That's a mistake.
Well, sir, thank you so much for joining us on Euronews. Appreciate it, as always. And let's go back to our top story because European leaders are gathering in Brussels. The summit is underway. And earlier, I spoke with Bulgaria's Prime Minister, Andrei Yurov. He is an important voice in the context of the border peace because Bulgaria was one of the few European countries to join in on this effort. I began by asking in our conversation, how concerning is it, this escalation in the Middle East when it comes to the economy and the politics?
We are pretty worried at the moment, simply because we don't know what the end game of the whole situation is. So Europe should speak in one voice here and try to get to the negotiation table and see what can be done so that this conflict de-escalates and how this will react then to supply chains, energy prices, and similars.
And what can be done? Because President Trump this week appeared to be angry at European allies and NATO, saying the one time we need help, they are not helping. What is the concern, or do you see European action in the Strait of Hormuz?
At the moment, I don't see direct involvement of the European Union in the Strait of Hormuz, but in any case, we are long-standing partners. Europe has always stood beside its allies and partners, and I think the right way forward is to get back to the negotiation table and discuss together with our partners how this war can be ended.
So it's about diplomacy now. Is there a diplomatic role when it comes to Iran, however? Because it seems the language coming out of Israel and certainly the U.S. is that this is a terrorist regime. It will not get done or changed through words. You still believe there's a diplomatic way out?
I think that one thing is certain, and the ballistic program and the nuclear enrichment of Iran has to be stopped. And there are different ways how to do this, and sometimes different diplomatic styles work well.
And on that note, diplomatic styles, at the start of the year, President Trump presented this border peace, and Bulgaria was one of the very few European countries that joined. The truth is, 2 months later, there's another war going on. It's not really brought peace. Was it a good idea to join this border peace?
Well, first of all, this treaty is not ratified by the Bulgarian parliament. It's being signed under the condition that it will be later ratified, and it's not been introduced yet in parliament. So we have not joined this board of peace. What we actually wanted to show is that Bulgaria supports the extensive plan for peace in Gaza. So what concerns Gaza and the board for peace, Bulgaria is supporting this area, but I don't think that the other treaty will be ever ratified.
So the Bulgarian parliament is probably not going to ratify this. In hindsight, do you look at it and go, well, it was a bad idea. Maybe Bulgaria should have thought about it twice, or at least look at the detail, the fine print?
Well, I think it would be an exaggeration to say that this is a Bulgarian position. It's not really a question of international politics. It's not even a question of local politics. It's actually a personal question of one oligarch, which is sanctioned by the Global Magnitsky Act. And the whole signing of this treaty has actually to do with him being removed from this list of sanctions. I don't think it's going to work. What is surprising, unfortunately, is the influence that this oligarch has over some pretty important parties in Bulgarian parliament.
So it seems to me that you are saying, yes, it was a political maneuver and perhaps a big mistake. Just as a final question, however, when it comes to the U.S. beyond the board of peace, how do you go about a president like President Trump, who is now asking for help but did not brief Europeans that a war was imminent in Iran? Is there a way that you can talk to a president like this? How do you go about what is, some would say, erratic diplomacy? Others would argue is unusual.
What is important in this kind of volatile situation is to preserve partnerships which have worked on both sides of the Atlantic for many years now. At the same time, of course, it is important that we talk, that we keep our eyes on the goal and be flexible in the means to achieve the goals.
Even when you have a president at times that has said the Europeans are weak, they're not helping. Now he says perhaps they face a bad future within NATO. Do you read between the words? Is that something that you have to do with President Trump, the language and then the action?
I see this as a stress test for the European Union, and we clearly recognize that the European Union should speak in one voice and it should get stronger and stand on its own feet.
And that message so far has been that this is not Europe's war. Prime Minister, thank you very much for joining us. Joining the board of peace was not Bulgaria's decision, but the decision of one oligarch. Very rarely you get this kind of language when you talk to politicians. That is, of course, Bulgaria's Prime Minister Andrei Yurgov. And now the other man of the hour here in Brussels, Prime Minister Viktor Orban. When he made his way into this Brussels summit today, he said there would be no money for Ukraine until and unless the Druzhba pipeline is restored, connecting Russia to Hungary. And he made good on that threat because he's still vetoing that loan. Let's go now to Marit Wynne-Jones. She's been monitoring the story for us here on Special Report. So Marit, the Prime Minister of Hungary is not moving an inch from his position.
Indeed, Maria, a very, very defiant Viktor Orban here today, as you said, saying, as long as there's no Russian oil flowing to my country via the Druzhba pipeline, I will be blocking this crucial 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine. Remember, that pipeline was damaged in late January in what Kyiv said was a Russian drone strike. But the Hungarian Prime Minister has directly pinned blame on the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, and this has really spilled out into a very public dispute. Now, EU leaders spent around 90 minutes trying to convince Orban to climb down, but to no avail, Maria. There was a really tense atmosphere. One diplomat told me that discussion was very fiery, and that's because EU leaders are very exasperated here. They say Ukraine desperately needs that money if it is to hold the front line, but also they're frustrated with the way that this has really spilled over into Orban's re-election campaign back at home, where he has even been accusing the EU and Ukraine of colluding with the Ukrainian opposition in order to weaken his position as he goes into this last stretch of this very crucial re-election campaign ahead of the elections on April the 12th, Maria.
Okay, so the election is coming up and the European leaders are exasperated, but that's not going to give Ukraine the money. So what comes next?
Well, exactly, because there is really no plan B, Maria. Either Orban approves this loan or Ukraine is not getting the money anytime soon. There are really two ways out, I would say, at this point. Either the Druzhba pipeline is repaired and the oil flows from Russia are restored into both Hungary and Slovakia. Orban then climbs down on his veto. Zelensky has said that those repair works could take as much as a month and a half, though, so that's not going to happen anytime soon. And realistically, the other really way out is that there is a result on April the 12th in that Hungarian election where Orban is not re-elected. That would also potentially solve this issue. So really all eyes, Maria, on what happens when Hungarians head to the ballot box in just a few weeks' time. Back to you.
Well, thank you for that, Marit. And of course, the flip side to the story is Ukraine. And earlier, I spoke with the Ukrainian Finance Minister, Sergei Marchenko, and I began by asking him this veto. How critical is it for Ukraine finances?
It's definitely not welcoming news from Brussels, but I think that all our counterparts and countries which support Ukraine are doing their best to secure Ukraine's financial needs for next 2 years. That's why I'm confident enough that rather sooner than later we will be able to get access for this 90 billion euro loan. And I have no doubt that will happen because we, practically speaking, have a very close cooperation with different European departments. We are finalizing right now our strategy, which includes all necessary spending facilities for our budget, defense leg as well as budget legs. So from our perspective, we are doing our best with relevant departments to prepare everything for a political perspective to be ready to kick off the loan.
So sooner than later, you say, but the Prime Minister of Hungary, he keeps repeating this pipeline, the Druzhba pipeline has been sabotaged on purpose. And he says if there's no oil, there's no money. Is that something that concerns you, that by the end of April, you'll have to wait until the end of the Ukrainian election, maybe even May, June, you may still not get this money? When does it become critical for Ukraine?
Well, I don't want to comment on any political sensitive question, so I believe that this question very sensitive politically. That's why please let me abstain for answering this question. I don't want to comment on any political questions which can question our credibility or give additional arguments for our opponents.
And of course, there's a third party here, and that is the EU, the European leaders. Today, the message that we heard is that a deal is a deal. This was agreed in December, and it needs to happen. But obviously, if it doesn't happen and there's no loan, is it time at some point, would you say, to think about a plan B, maybe bilateral contributions on the interim, bring up back again the idea of the Russian frozen assets?
Thank you, Maria, for mentioning frozen Russian assets. It's a good hint for us to repeat that we are ready to open again this discussion. I think that in December, these intermediate steps, which provide us 90 billion loan, was a good signal of support of Ukraine. But the best possible signal is a reparation loan. Definitely, it's something we really needed. That's why if there is no solution for Plan A, so let's speak about any other sort of possible decision.
So you're saying, if I understand correctly, that for Ukraine, you have not given up on the frozen assets. You've not given up on the reparations loan.
Of course not. Of course not. It's our strategy. We really think that it's fair enough to expect that Russia should pay for the damages they done in Ukraine. That's why no doubts from my side. I repeated this in my meetings with G7 ministers of finance. In December, I mentioned that we are not happy that this decision. Of course, we are grateful for this decision, but we fair enough to expect that bigger decision can appear.
And Minister, of course, your job is to make sure that the Ukrainian economy is able to operate in very difficult circumstances. I do wonder, however, the idea of a ceasefire, it has been floated many times. Ukraine says it's ready to accept it. Russia has not until now. When you look at the rest of the year and maybe even going into 2027, are you preparing for a budget that is still dedicated to war?
Well, we are very pragmatic in our ministry, so any positive scenarios, of course, we are welcoming any negotiations. We really take care about our stance on this matter. But to be honest with you, we are preparing for any scenario for us. That's why, despite the fact that we plan ongoing war for this year only, we are ready to start thinking what we can do in 2027 and to prepare ourselves for a longer war.
And just as a final question, sir, of course, there is the other pressure point, and that is sanctions. We are seeing the situation in the Middle East is also complicating things for Ukraine. There has been some easing of sanctions, certainly when it comes to Russian oil. How do you assess that? Is that something that you say it is a really bad idea? Or do you understand where the thinking is coming from?
I don't want to estimate decisions which now different leaders are making in a rush. Because when you in a rush, you're making some very quick decisions which are not fully prepared. That's why I prefer to stick to the real strategy to impose additional sanctions on Russia. Right now, it's like he provides them with additional benefits to wage a war in Ukraine.
Well, Minister, thank you so much for joining us on this special program, and appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
And that was Ukrainian Finance Minister Sergei Marchenko saying when you make decisions in a rush, you can make mistakes. That is, of course, a reference to that decision from the U.S. administration to ease some of the sanctions on Russian oil at sea because the energy question is very much at play in this summit. We've seen oil prices now hover above $100 a barrel. Gas prices today up 30%. This is going to have a major repercussion on the European industry and the European households. And this is one of the themes debated by leaders today here in Brussels. Let's go back now to Shauna Mary, who's been monitoring the story for us. Now, Shauna, let's go back to the Middle East. The Europeans keep saying this needs a way out and it should be diplomatic. How can they do this? Do they have a voice?
Well, that's the key question. I think that's really important. But actually, you know, at the start of this show, we talked about how EU leaders had finished their discussions on the Middle East. And the conclusions were, you know, fairly weak and fairly light, calling for a de-escalation and saying that they would try to discuss with the United States and amongst themselves about a way forward to securing the Strait of Hormuz. But actually, in the last few minutes, I've heard from EU sources that now EU leaders are reconsidering those conclusions and they want to restart the discussion on Iran, not just Iran, but the overflow into Lebanon, and the wider Middle East, in particular, taking into account those skyrocketing oil and gas prices. So we don't know exactly what they want to change in the conclusions, but certainly a lot of them are feeling that they really aren't punchy enough, and also taking into account that this war is coming into 3 weeks now at this point, but it's not nearing an end. And also a lot of sources also saying to me that people are quite annoyed, or EU leaders, member states are quite annoyed about the fact that they don't understand the objectives yet or the contours or the parameters of this conflict. Maria?
And of course, the situation in Lebanon has escalated over the past few days, and we'll bring you the latest, of course, on Euronews. And let's go now to Geneva, because we are joined by Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. Sir, thank you so much for joining us on Euronews. Before we start, however, I want to play you this clip. Let's take a look.
There are no alternative of international rules-based order, because the alternative is the war in Ukraine. The alternative is unfair competition on trade.
We will continue to ask for de-escalation. What we saw this morning happening over the last hours has a direct impact on the region, but also on Europe, not only in terms of security, but also in terms of rising prices that we see on energy sources that we are dependent on.
Iran's attacks on Qatar energy infrastructure create further chaos, and it's clear that we need an exit from this war, not escalation.
This is a very defining moment for the European Union, and I think that we need to send a clear message to our citizens and the rest of the world that Europe is with multilateralism and is with international law, and we are against this war.
Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. And let me go back to you, because those are the comments from the head of the European Council, the head of the European Parliament, the top European diplomat, the Spanish Prime Minister. They say this war needs an exit, and we're now seeing major escalation having huge economic repercussions. This war needs an exit. You heard it yourself. How do you respond to that?
That we need diplomacy when it comes to Iran, but Iran with their terror regime that has been really dictating what's happening in the Middle East, sending money and arms to their proxies all over the Middle East, undermining even in Europe terrorism that has been going on, and developing their nuclear program. There's no time now anymore for diplomacy, and we are winning the war in diminishing their military capabilities.
And sir, when you say we are winning the war, what does that mean? What does victory mean in the eyes of Israel?
Well, we have to take out their nuclear program. We have to get rid of their missile program. We have to stop their assistance sending money to the proxies. They sent $1 billion last year to Hezbollah, and to the Houthis they send money, and to Iraq and everyone else. And they have to stop terrorizing their own people. You know, now there is the Nowruz festival in Iran, and the people there cannot go out freely and celebrate.
But, sir, you know, a few weeks ago I spoke with your foreign minister, Gideon Sar, who said ultimately it comes down to the Iranian people to decide who leads them. But Israel wants to create the conditions on the ground for regime change. What we're seeing now, however, is retaliation from Iran, a mess in the energy market. The regime is still in place, doubling down, and we're not seeing protests. So, again, I ask you, how are you winning the war?
Well, the regime is weak. We have taken out their military leaders, and they are now really, I think, much weaker than they were 3 weeks ago. Their nuclear program cannot continue. Their missile program cannot continue. The people are there, have been suffering for so many years, and I think that we will see some change in Iran.
What do you mean by that? We're going to see some changes in Iran. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's about time that this regime is weakened in a way that the people there can say what they want for their own future. It's not up to Israel to decide what is their future, but definitely this regime of terror has really got to go.
Okay, and I ask you, what do you mean by that? Because today, once again, we heard from the president of the U.S. Giving a timeline that is at times erratic, saying this will end soon, no troops on the ground, and also saying the goals will be met, but it's unclear what it means for the U.S., and also saying that Israel cannot hit energy fields in the Middle East. Do you see that as the U.S. now unhappy, calling you out?
Yes, so... First of all, Maria, I'd like to tell you what happened just 2 days ago when the Iranians sent missiles on Jerusalem and debris fell on the holy places in Jerusalem, on the Holy Sepulchre, on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and on the Temple Mount, the Kotel. And I don't hear the world calling out the Iranians for terrorizing Israel civilians and terrorizing 12 countries in the Middle East. What about them shooting towards Europe, towards Cyprus, towards Turkey? Why do we not hear people say to Iran, stop terrorizing your own people, the region, stop trying to stop the oil going through the Hormuz Straits, doing these things that are terrorizing the world. It's about time that Iran stops their behavior, and we see a change there.
So you say, why is the world not calling this out? Does that mean that you're alone, ultimately? We've seen today European leaders still saying this needs to stop, this escalation. The Spanish prime minister is saying this war is illegal. Do you feel alone?
No, we definitely do not feel alone. The United States and Israel is in this war together, and we have a lot of support internationally. We hear a lot of calls on diplomacy from the Europeans. I think this is not time for diplomacy. This is time to really end diplomacy and to start seeing a change in Iran.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us on Euronews today in this ongoing story, because as I say, the meeting here in Brussels, the 27 heads of states are gathering here, very much dominated by the situation in the Middle East. But that is also going to have economic repercussions on the European economy. Today, the ECB also warning that we could enter a period of stagflation, that is low growth and high inflation. To debrief, we are joined by Enrico Letta, who, of course, is a former Italian prime minister, but also penned a very influential report about how to reboost the European economy. Mr. Letta, I got to ask you, from an economic perspective, how worried are you?
I'm very worried. I think what is happening is a disaster for today, but is a disaster also for tomorrow, for the next weeks, for the next months. It is clear that there's an energy cost that is growing. There's big instability, and I think the recovery that we were expecting will be more difficult. So, yes, very much worried.
I cannot hear. Is he speaking? Okay, well, Mr. Lett, I got to ask you on that point. Of course, when you penned your report, you did point out a number of areas in which the European economy could become more agile. Do you worry, however, this very volatile situation is going to make it even harder to implement your report, the words of Mario Draghi, to talk about a stronger European economy? Because we are seeing major disagreements on things like green policy. Should it be kept or should it go?
The European Council that is taking place today and tomorrow is a European Council that has to take important decisions on competitiveness. It was supposed to be the European Council for competitiveness. And unfortunately, this incredible situation is changing everything. So my hope is that the European Council will be able in any case, to take all the important decisions to launch this plan. The name of the plan is One Europe, One Market, because it is clear that in this new situation, Europe has to be more united. We need to have Europe more united. And at the same time, the European Union has to intervene immediately for the immediate consequences on cost of energy. But I repeat, what is important is not to under-evaluate the absolute need to take structural decisions for the future of the European economy. And the agenda of this meeting, I hope, can be confirmed.
When you say the Europeans are going to have to intervene, is that an intervention in the energy market? Is that an intervention that looks like the emergency measures that were introduced in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine? What kind of intervention are you referring to?
It is clear that today the only possible intervention is to lower the energy prices, reducing taxes and with subsidies at the national level and at European level. But this is for the immediate. What is important is that the European Union has to take the decisions to foster and integrate the single market, the economy, integrating financial markets, creating the energy union. The big difficulty today is also because we don't have energy union. We don't have interconnectivity completed at the European level. We don't have a united financial market. So we are confronted by structural problems and at the same time with an issue that is very conjunctural. So I think the European leaders, they have to intervene on both sides. Immediate interventions to lower the cost of energy today, but they have to continue working on implementing the reports on how to strengthen European economy, integrating the single market, creating this plan, One Europe, One Market, that is for the next months and next years. The main problem with Trump, is Trump is setting the agenda every day in a different way. The European leaders, they have to be very, very focused on their own agenda. That is fundamental.
But I got to be very honest at this point. Do you believe this European leadership is up to the task? Can Ursula von der Leyen get this job done? Emmanuel Macron, the German chancellor, because many would argue at this stage, your report came out 2 years ago. Draghi's report came out 2 years ago. It's all talk, no action.
Yesterday, the European Commission launched this plan, EU Inch, for the so-called 28th regime, for creating new companies and having a corporate law specifically simple for companies, for enterprises, and I think it is a good first step. It is clear that this council was supposed to be the one to implement the economic structural measures, and it is clear that if this council is totally kidnapped by the present crisis on the Hormuz, it is clear that the main damages for Europe are also the damages related to the fact that Europe is not able to take the decisions that Europe has to take for the next and long-term issues on structural. So I hope the leaders will be able to tackle the present crisis, but at the same time, they have to think on the structural problems Europe has, and they have to implement this plan, One Europe, One Market, that was the reason of the meeting before the Iran crisis.
And of course, thank you so much, Mr. Letta, for joining us. This meeting, this summit underway continues. You can catch the latest on Euronews, on the focus certainly on the energy impact of this war. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great night.